Earl, good to see you. Sandy, good to see you. Margie's here, but she is on. She's resting as she watches as well. It's good to have you all here. We're talking about learning to dance in the rain. How many have noticed that there's a bit of rain around us these days? So I want you to introduce yourself in a second and just say one bit of what it is that is scary, difficult, challenging about the current space that we're in. All right. And so I'll just call on you one by one and just tell us that. So Nancy. Don't forget to unmute. Keep working on it. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, excuse me, left-hand corner, there's an unmute button. Try pushing that.
I think I unmuted myself.
There you go.
I think the unknown, and that's, yeah. But I think truly, we have always had the unknown.
Yeah, but this has all brought it very much to the forefront, hasn't it?
You bet. You bet.
Absolutely. John, how about you?
Oh, I would say separation from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Scott?
A lot of things that we were planning to do with our family has been disrupted. The biggest thing, though, I think, is the work with JFON and the uncertainty of what's going to happen with all the vulnerable people in the immigration system.
Yeah, those disruptions that suddenly everything is in flux that we didn't think was in flux. Doris?
Yeah.
You're still muted, Doris.
Okay. I worry most about members of my family that are in direct health care. My daughter works in an emergency room in Phoenix, and my sister and niece both work in a hospital in California, and my other sister's a nursing assistant at a nursing home. So they're all in
very difficult
possible
situations.
Direct contact, especially my niece who's working in a COVID ward in a hospital.
Yeah.
So
wow.
It's tough. I worry about them.
Challenging. Joe, how about you?
Well, I think we've talked a lot about changes in work responsibilities and roles and just thinking about our friends and family and how so many of us are having to readjust the way we're doing our jobs. I'm a first grade teacher, and so, I'm teaching from home, which has been really challenging.
Thank you. Diane? Is her microphone not working, John?
Yeah, we're getting audio through her.
Okay. I'm going to go to Earl and Sandy as you try to figure that out. Earl and Sandy, tell us something about the rain in your life.
Okay, Earl and Sandy are both here. Sandy, you want to say something?
Well, we are in pretty good straits because our boy is taking care of us for shopping. And as long as I have coffee and broccoli, I'm okay.
You know what, but some of those things about like somebody having to do the shopping for us, or the reality that may or may not be, all the different things out there, or just the thought that there may not be, all toss some uncertainty into us, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Earl, how about you?
Yeah, we're in this together, so that certainly helps.
Margie's going to be listening, and I'll let her step in whenever she wants to, but just know that she's listening to you. John, how'd it work with Diane? Did we get something? Oh, there she is. You improved, John
Okay.
Wilson.
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. I think part of the uncertainty when we cannot wrap our arms around each other either.
Absolutely. That lack of physical contact
Yeah.
is important.
We have two, a child and a grandchild working in hospitals, so that is a concern too.
Yeah. So the basic idea of this class is that life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. It is about learning to dance in the rain. Right? So in the middle of this rainstorm that we have, this storm that's going on around us, how do we move forward with the positivity that the particular moment doesn't necessarily speak of, but that a longer view says can happen? And that's hard to do because our current perspective, whatever it is, yells that truth so much that sometimes it hides whatever's beyond that. And what hope is hope is the sense that there is something there, that winter does end. And Nancy, the first time I ever went to Minnesota was for Christmas time. And I told my mother-in-law at the time, I said, next time I come for Christmas in Minnesota, it will be in July. Because we know July happens in Minnesota, but it doesn't feel like it in the middle of that winter, right? And part of our job is to whisper those messages, those messages of spring coming when another snowstorm hits. And that's a lot of what we have to do in the midst of all this. The hardest part about living the spiritual life is separating our own personal perspective and desires and ways of viewing things, our aims in life, and seeing it from a larger perspective, which I'm going to call the God perspective. That God perspective sees or speaks more than just what my eyes, my spirit senses. And so that perspective calls us from what feels right or even appropriate in this moment to something bigger than just that. And it's going to feel hard, awkward, wrong sometimes for us to be able to move into that larger space. It's not going to always make sense because the present moment for us is going to speak its message so loud that we're going to want to hold on to that. But we have to know that our own perspective, however much right it has, is also blinding us to something more. And hope is trying to hold up that something more to us, not necessarily trying to hide the truth of what we have. It's not trying to deny that truth. It's just trying to say there's something more than that. So those of you who have been pregnant and given birth, how did you get through that pain, that struggle of the birth process? Because at least part of your self says, I don't want to do this. Is this worth it? How do you get past that? That's the type of question that we're asking. So let me ask that as a real question. Those of you who have given birth, how did you find hope in the midst of that? How do you get past the pain, the struggle? Go ahead.
Well, okay. This is Diane speaking. I think it was just that it was something that had to be done. You had no choice at that point. You had to go on.
Yeah. You know that here's the rain happening. It's going to hurt. It's going to be whatever, and you keep moving. So you're right. At least part of the dancing in the rain is that you don't stop because right now it's hard. What else? Okay, so the issue with all of this is to say that we have to allow that larger perspective, that if we can call it this, the desires of God, of the divine, we have to let that inform who we are, not always the other way around. Place our perspective overlaying God's, and have God's perspective overlay ours, not deny ours, but overlay it so it says a bigger issue. The parables, which is what we're going to look at, allow us to be able to do that in a wonderful way. Jesus was remarkable in that as he told these stories, instead of telling definitive truth, he tried to give us things that would give us images of what could be. And all the different ways that could be both right and wrong. The hard part is that we see sometimes, and sometimes Jesus's parables are judgment parables. Who is the right person, who's the wrong person. But as a general rule, that's not his purpose. There seems to be sometimes some right or wrong in them, and that will be present in the very first parable we're going to look at. But we have to realize that he's not really looking at it that way. Jesus emerges out of a tradition, the Jewish tradition, which has a long history of God only speaks to this group of people. But that comes from our God only speaks, not that the divine only speaks that way. And so our God has chosen this type of perspective for us. And so it sometimes, in the midst of that, belays the effects on other people, the judgment that falls on other people because of that. It's not trying to speak a universal God as much as what we do today. So we have to sometimes step away from that as we look at these and see that it's not trying to say what God doesn't like so much as what God's doing in the midst of this moment with this group of people. So it comes with a challenge as well as a hope. Every parable does. And we have to look at those challenges and how to face those challenges in order to get to the hope. So for every parable that we look at, there's a series of questions that you have to ask. Why do I, in fact, I'll put these up here for you so you can see them. Why do I feel challenged by this parable? Not in generalized ways, but very specifically, what fear does it put in my heart? How does the parable make following the spiritual life much more difficult for me? How do I have to change? Or what would I have to become because of this parable? How is Jesus drawing us towards hope? What is the hope that is there in spite of whatever it is I don't understand? And then lastly, what do we need to do to get past the challenge? So we're going to practice with a parable called the parable of the sower. It comes from Matthew 13. It's in all of the three gospels, and it's pretty close to the same in all of the three first gospels. And it says this. To you it is, excuse me. Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. So three of the different places where they fell, something negative happened. So that's the judgment. and it feels easy to be able to sit in that space of judgment and be able to say, oh, look, so and so, they fell on this kind of ground and they didn't spring up. That's not what it's about. It's about how do we find the way to find the good soil and what stands in our way. In the midst of today, whatever it is, there's a lot of not easy soil. Today I was talking to my cousin Bob. He lives up in eastern Arizona, and he likes Trump a lot. And so when he posts something, I struggle with his posts and trying to figure out how to respond to him, trying to figure out where the good soil is in that relationship is not always simple. And so sometimes my seed falls in one of those other areas where it springs up quickly because it was such good words, but it gets knocked down really quick, or it finds no root at all. How is it that in the midst of what you're dealing with, you see those different ways of being able to, of seeing how the seeds grow? Let's go back and look at the different ones. It says, first of all, that there was there were the ones that fell on a path, a place where we don't want seeds to grow. And what happens? Birds come and find it, and it gets swept away, carried off. So where have you had your good intentions, your seeds carried off into wherever, where people haven't listened to them at all? Like my friend, like my cousin Bob, doesn't listen to me very well these days. No matter how good my seeds are.
Jim, I think for me, it was, when something in life happens that you're least expecting, like breast cancer. So, you're growing on the right path, and then a bird comes and plucks you away and puts you in a place you really didn't want to be. So I think life challenges can do that. You've got a plan, you're on the path, and then something happens that you never expected. You lost your job, you got a divorce, whatever that case may be, that really takes you on a new path altogether.
Yes, thank you. And there's no doubt that all of this social isolation, all of our response, all of the possibility of response right now makes it really hard for us to be in a space of what we would want to have ahead of us. It's disrupted all our plans. Right? So what birds are attacking you? What birds are taking away your stuff?
I think for me, it's trying to figure out how to, I don't know, give advice is probably the wrong thing, but when my kids ask me, well, what should I do about X? My older daughter's trying to figure out, or my granddaughter's in Alabama. Should I make her come home? She's at college there, going online. What should I do? And, my younger daughter, well, should I come visit you? Should I not come visit you? And just trying to figure out what things to tell people when they ask.
Yeah. The hard part about being a pastor is you have lots of good right answers, which means that sometimes your answers don't work in the specifics, no matter how good they are, right? And as parents, we often have that as well. We think we know what our kids should do, but the reality is that sometimes it's not the right answer, even though it's the right answer. It's not the one they're going to grab hold of and take and move with. part of what you want to look at here with this parable is you want to make sure that you don't see each of the seeds as a person, right? That it's some people whose ideas are carried off by the birds. But it's you and all of who you are. That there's part of you, part of your things that won't sprout, because whatever it is carries them away. Part of it falls on spaces where they spring up easily. You have great ideas, but then they wither away under the sun. How many have ever had a great plan? Something that you thought was going to work wonderful. Scott, this seems to reflect part of what your hope is for JFON. JFON has been doing wonderful, and in the midst of this, there's a lot of beating of the sun on that ministry. And can it survive the beating of that sun? We don't know, do we? For sure that the IN project is looking at that possibility right now. In the midst of COVID, as well as what's going on in our government, can the IN project survive? We already had to deal with that, Doris, didn't we, here at St. Francis? Can we continue our IN project? And our decision was we had to end it, that it was time. And that to me was a hard decision, because my own desires were very different than with that larger picture of what was true out there. But how do you let go of what you think is true and move towards the next phase? What's hardest for you about the letting go?
I think for me, Jim, it's the things that I worked hard on to make positive changes that I hoped would happen,
Yeah,
and feeling like they're so easily eroded. And there's a lot of grief around that.
there is. But the hard part oftentimes, Diane, is that we think that what we're doing is for the eternities, right? We want to make it so that it's something that never goes away. That's a lot of ego, because we all know that even the really great things of the world crumble anyway. So for us to think that our stuff does continue forever, but we do want it to have purpose, meaning, depth. But sometimes it's not as long-lived as what we think it is, or what we hope it could be. And that's always difficult for ego. How about the rest of you? So where does hope lie in the midst of this parable about all the seeds that don't grow?
Hope lies with the future of the kids.
That's right.
They may have a better future than we think is possible, and we pray that they will.
Yeah. You know, the tough part about seeds, I don't know how much of you got, how many of you have had a lot of done a lot of work in agriculture. You don't expect every seed to grow perfectly. In fact, you know that there are parts of the field which will not grow very well because they get less of the water or too much of the water. And so the edge of the field almost always have smaller plants, right? But you don't worry about that. You worry about the field entire, and you're trying to say, how do I make this be as good as possible in the whole? So
Jim,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think I find hope in seen other people reaching out. You know, we've seen lots of things on TV where someone has just done a kind gesture. I am on a stream of people in our neighborhood, and people offering toilet paper to someone. They got extra, so who needs some? And then finding something that you can or that I can do. My mom is making headbands for healthcare workers by sewing on buttons. Just something that you can do just yourself to reach out to even one person gives me hope, because that reminds me that there is so much good amidst all the crazy things that seem to be happening.
Joni is a good example too of the larger picture. If you look at just how she's succeeded with this group of first graders versus last year's group of first graders, she's failed, right, in comparison, because all this stuff has gotten in the way of what she wished she could have done. But that's true of every single teacher in every single grade level this year. All of this social isolation and the closing of schools has made it so that this year is relatively a failure. And it means that next year's second graders the teachers will have to start at a different level than what they've started with before. Doesn't really mean failure, but it feels like failure in the moment if you let it. But it also is the space of where we get to have a different conversation, isn't it? How does that second grade teacher take the kids that Joni has this year and start with them differently and speak with them in ways that changes the whole conversation? One of the things that's been fun for me, maybe not for her, is to look at the skills that Joni's having to develop at the end of the year that she hasn't had to have before as she's doing all this distance learning. Now, is that something that continues into next year? Who knows? And in what form? Joan?
Well, it's also the end of my career, because I, see myself as someone nearing retirement. And so I don't need to know all that computer technology stuff because I'm on my way out. But it's really forced me to have to just, get this growth mindset of I do have to learn it because it applies today.
So I want to hop forward to a couple of the other parables that talk in the same way. All of the parables we're dealing with today are seed parables. They're the parables of what right now looks small and unusable, but yet about how it grows into something more, right? One of the truths about first graders, for example, is that they are still very underdeveloped in many of their academic skills. And if you have to measure the whole of the child by what they know at first grade, they fall short. So they are a seed that Joni is beginning to plant and moving towards something. And it's hard in the midst of seeing only the seed to know what might be present. So in the midst of COVID-19, in the midst of our political differences and our challenges, the future of possibilities is difficult for us to recognize and value. But what these parables are all talking about is what can be. So let me read you the next parable. It says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." What seems small today that might grow beyond your imaginations? So I've been looking at the way people have been posting pictures of their high school graduations. right? What they looked like at 17, 18 years old as they were getting their diplomas. And some of them have changed an awful lot. Become much different than what they were at that time, right? We think we know right now, don't we? But what might be? What's beginning to become a mustard plant? Not just the tiny little seed, but what possibilities do you see in the midst of the stuff we're facing today?
I find that I'm basically an introvert, so staying at home has not been a big issue for me because I stay at home anyway. But I've found that I really like to reach out to people more than I used to. And I've had other people reach out to me. A cousin that I hadn't seen in probably 10, 12 years sent me a message on Facebook the other day, just wanting to know how we were. And so I think that this could be the beginning of people, no matter what kind of person they are, having just different relationships out of this.
I agree. I think we get to re-choose relationships because of all this. How about the rest of you? What possibilities do you see? And they may be teeny tiny glimpses of something.
Every time I talk, you see it. Like so.
I think I see an appreciation of so many things that we have taken for granted. Real simple things that, you know, other people wish they had in other countries. And we are now learning what it's like to live without some of those extra things that we've taken for granted for so long.
Isn't it amazing that as we've been in isolation, it's not as hard as what it could be. Why? Because we have enough resources, enough reserves that we're able to be separated and without. Much easier than what our friends down at the refuge, down in Peru, they live more day to day, hand to mouth. And so we forget that in the midst of our abundance. How about the rest of you?
Just thinking about the education system that we've been talking about, and the fact that students aren't able to gather with teachers in a setting, and all of the different experiments that are going on to do learning via the internet, and just even this class that we're doing right now with all of us in our different locations. Our younger daughter is doing most of her work from home at Scripps, and she has our twin grandsons at home, and they're doing daily schoolwork there, and she has an interaction with them on that wasn't possible when she was in her office and they were in a classroom.
Yes.
So new dynamics are coming forth. Yesterday, our oldest grandson just presented a kind of a thesis of his senior year of college on a project that he was working on to his professors. And we were able to watch that presentation.
Wow.
And, you know, that never would have happened before when somebody did a presentation. The parents, grandparents, other friends weren't there to see that. So it has new challenges and maybe some new fears, but it also has great opportunities for what we can create out of this.
And it's all those new challenges and those challenges and fears that sometimes stop us in seeing and appreciating the possibility, right? We do a whole lot sometimes about fighting the challenge and not accepting the possibility of that new thing. Any of the we've never done it this way before sometimes gets in the way of the possibilities of what this new thing can be.
I think the coming together of groups, subgroups, oh boy, even though they can't be in the same room, have discovered each other to do things like make masks and offer, and then they develop immediate friendships through that honor and the great privilege of contributing something that is helpful to others whom they can't see or don't see is just really remarkable. That's the spirit at work.
Yeah, yeah, nice. Margie,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. I've just been thinking about, I'm doing this project with Casa Maria, but how easy it has been in our society in the past to be stratified, for people that have more resources to not be aware of how much need there really is. But right now, because of what's happening, there's so many people losing jobs that we're finding out how many people in the country are so close to the edge, and it just doesn't take much. They are living, day to day, really. And many of us have just not been aware of that. And so I think, it's really, we're seeing so many images of that every day now, that there's the possibility of really a more compassionate society and culture coming out of this, which gives me a lot of hope.
Absolutely. Thank you, Margie. The difficulty sometimes about that, though, is that it means that I'm not the one in control of everything. Anybody else have that problem with stuff? That the picture is larger than just you, right? What you have to learn as a first grade teacher like Joni is that you have to depend on a whole bunch of other teachers to get that kid to the end of their educational path. No matter how much you want them to remember you wonderfully and perfectly, sometimes they forget, right? Because their second grade teacher or their third grade or their fourth grade teacher has become more immediately important to them. Doesn't necessarily diminish who you are, but it does change their relationship to you in some ways. So there's another parable that kind of helps that way. Listen to this one. The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest has come. You see, it's not all dependent on just me. No matter how much my ego says it is, no matter how much I want to really control it all, the sun, the rain, the elements around also have an effect on all of this. And I think sometimes this social isolation, one of the great gifts it's giving to us, is my dependence on something more than just me. What is it that you've learned to trust a little more? Who have you learned to trust a little more? Or to appreciate, maybe is a good thing. Like, how many appreciate restaurants now that you can't go there very much? Who else? And what else?
I think it's one thing when I stay at home because I choose to, which I was doing before, and not going out just if I didn't have errands. I would stay home sometimes, but the fact of really having to be mindful now about leaving my house and going out and what am I going to achieve or accomplish, really having to consider it before I leave the house. I think that's a big change.
Yeah, and you have to just think about things, don't you?
I think there's also the element of the further responsibility we have. We're certainly protecting ourselves by going out infrequently, but we're also protecting other people because who knows what we might be carrying. And I feel a responsibility to wear the mask to be sure I'm not carrying anything to somebody else.
I think one of the interesting things about masks is that, as a typical rule, we see them as a protection against them, but in a very real way, what they're asking us to do is to wear them as a protection for them, to change our thinking about what those masks are for, to say that whatever negative things might be inside of us, even unknown, we need to keep within us. And so I think that shift alone might help us a lot, as we see not just the enemy outside, but the way I can protect them from the enemy within me. Because we see each other too easily from the negative aspect, don't we?
Yeah,
And at least go ahead.
I think the whole mask thing it's an altruistic action that we take to help others. What really convinced me was a public service announcement that was done in the Czech Republic, where my friend's son lives there. And it talked about wearing a mask, but their slogan was, "I protect you, you protect me."
Wow.
And they went from nobody wearing a mask to 3 days later, everybody in the country was wearing masks.
Wow.
Protect each other.
I protect you, you protect me. What a great slogan.
Yeah.
Nicely done. I think that reminds us too, in the larger picture, how much this is not just if Tucson survives, but our connection over to the Czech Republic, and in a pandemic like this, which literally means a thing of all of us. Do we know the dependence we have on those people in far off countries who have to battle it there so that together we solve it? Because it doesn't matter if just one country solves it. If it stays active and growing somewhere, then sooner or later it will come back and haunt. We need a lot of people to solve it, don't we?
Hi. Could I say something about, I think when we've seen the skyline of Los Angeles and how the pollution has let up so much in many, many places because of the slowdown in our economy and travel, I think we have an opportunity to decide what kind of a world we want and what our responsibilities are to other people, and what we want to look like and be like when this is over.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. We get to choose in all of this. So let me read the last parable. It's called it's typically called the wheat and the tares. It goes like this. The kingdom of God may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in the ground, but while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up, and bore grain. Then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. We think we know now what's good and what's bad, but sometimes in the uprooting of the bad, we hurt the good as well. How do we, in the midst of all this, not just fight the bad, but care for the good? How do we make sure we don't just make the enemy, but that we do the good work in all this? That's hard, isn't it? Because sometimes the enemy, whatever the enemy is, seems to be, that has to be my first concern. But I love, for example, Scott, what happens with JFON is JFON is essentially an answer to that question some people have asked. Why aren't you giving a legal way for people to come, right? Why don't they come legally? And JFON says, well, we're trying, right? And it's about helping, not fighting the negative aspects, but about producing the good that is there.
Well, how about voting? We have a power. And
How about voting? This is exactly right. You don't have to necessarily fight against whatever you think is wrong. You have to vote for what can be right.
Right.
So it's about the opposite of a judgment, in that you're not necessarily, it's not that you're not noticing the weeds among the wheat. It's that you're allowing the wheat to grow strong and powerful so that you can at some point or another harvest that which is best. What is the best of what we want and need out of this time? What is it we need to focus on? What do you hope comes out of this moment?
More compassion.
More compassion.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
Several of the things that were just discussed made me reflect on the parallels between this and global warming and climate change, both being things that are affecting the entire planet, and the wondering if we cannot learn from this about how we might deal with that, in many ways, bigger issue, but not as immediate, around climate change.
And I agree, Scott, that's exactly what we have to do, is start seeing those larger issues and moving towards the solving of those, and not necessarily the beating up of my cousin Bob, who doesn't get my views of, although he really needs to be fixed. He really does. But trying to focus ourselves on what really needs to help all of us. How do we find those more global perspectives? So what stops you from seeing that larger perspective? Where do you get caught up in the weeds, so to speak?
I think there's some fear that the weeds will win out.
There is some fear that way. Dang it.
Sometimes it's just so easy to get mad at people, whoever the people are that you think are doing things wrongly. And I think it's, for me, if I let myself do that, I kind of spiral down into a hopelessness. And it works better if I can just focus on the things that are doing right, like the neighborhoods that are coordinating with each other, and the truck drivers who keep going even though they have no place to eat on the road, and so on. Just admiring the people who are doing a good job rather than focusing on the things that I don't like.
Yeah. The hard part is those things you don't like definitely stand out and stand in many ways in the way. And so it's hard to figure out how to not give them credence because of the very real presence right there. But if you're busy fighting that person, sometimes you're not doing the work that will carry that which you care about more forward. What else? How do we hold that longer view? How do we have hope that the best can come out of this moment, not the worst?
I think trying to put yourself in another's shoes, I'm thinking in a small way of our daily walks. And you start to meet someone on the sidewalk, and who is going to move first? Well, a lot of times if there's dogs and animals, their owners will be proactive, go out. But you just look at somebody and they are so concerned now about your welfare. And I think just starting small,
Yeah.
person to person, is going to help.
So Sandy, you reminded me of an event that happened 2 years ago. I took a lot of our youth down to an area that I'm very familiar with, San Luis, just across the border in Mexico, near Yuma. And we went and helped build a house down there. And Allison, one of our youth, was just amazed at the dogs there, right? And she said, they just lie around all the streets. Doesn't anybody own them, she said, because she was seeing them from a particular perspective, which is an American perspective, that we hold our animals inside our yards and keep them there. But if you noticed also, our animals also have a lot more aggressive behavior outside of our thing because they are territorial animals, and so they think they have to protect. And so they bark at those who come close. The dogs in Mexico do not bark at folks as a general rule because they're no longer protecting their territory. Mm-hmm. By giving them a small space that is theirs, we actually make it so that they fight for what they don't have to fight for at all. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes here in our current politics, we've done a whole bunch of smalling down things that we have to protect. And when I attacked my cousin Bob, I almost put him in a space where he has to defend a very small issue instead of encouraging him to move towards that larger perspective. And so we give a neuroses to each other instead of encouraging the best out of each other. Hope will always draw us towards that best. But it takes us getting beyond our small boxes to be able to see hope. Next week, we're going to talk about two parables you might have heard of, where Jesus definitely takes a small perspective and says, look at it differently. The two you're going to read are the two parables that are only found in the book of Luke, but they're two of our most well-known parables. One is the Good Samaritan, and one is the prodigal son. if you will read those ahead of time, the Good Samaritan is in Luke 10, and the prodigal son, and we really should call that not the prodigal son, but the prodigal sons, plural, is in Luke 15. And if you'll read those two ahead of time, you'll see how Jesus takes a small answer and says, look larger. See the bigger picture. Be the bigger picture in a lot of ways. All right? Thank you very much for being here. I have to go to the in-board meeting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Here again.